On October 14th, 1884, with the noon temperature holding at 31 degrees and a dry north wind carrying alkali dust through every gap in town boards, Sage Hollow watched 19-year-old Cole Fisher step off her father's claim with a bedroll tied in baling cord, a dented tin cup, and a canvas sack that clinked not with coins but with seed packets. Sage Hollow was a settlement of 312 souls in Wyoming Territory, 12 years old and proud of being called permanent, though its permanence rested on one rail stop, one general store, and the assumption that freight would keep arriving on time. Men paused outside the hitch posts to watch. Women at the pump lowered their voices and did not stop drawing water. Cole did not ask for witness or mercy. She crossed the road, stood once to settle the sack higher on her shoulder, and walked west toward ground no one wanted, where the soil dried white and bitter after rain and even rabbit brush looked thin. Her father, Gideon Fisher, had been dead 10 months by then, taken in January by a chest sickness that settled deep and did not lift after the second thaw. He had left tools, one narrow claim, and debts layered by 2 bad seasons, freight fees, and a mule lost to a ravine above Elk Draw. The claim did not pass to Cole in practice, whatever papers implied in principle. Notes were called, liens tightened, and the arithmetic of men with ledgers moved faster than grief. Cole was not married, had no brother in town, and possessed no credit line at Silas Pemberton's counter. What she had instead was a habit of record that had become discipline long before anyone noticed. At 14, she'd begun marking geese flight heights by fence post and cottonwood limb. At 15, she'd measured ant mound collars with twine against her own finger width. At 16, she'd kept sketches of beaver dam elevation after spring runoff near the creek bend. At 17 and 18, she had tracked first hard frost against moon phase and wind direction, writing by lantern on scrap paper, and then recopying into a stitched ledger she kept wrapped in oiled cloth. No teacher had handed her a doctrine. The knowledge came by accumulation, by error and correction, by standing in sleet to check a mark she had written wrong the day before. In 5 consecutive years, she had compared signs that others treated as country talk and found repeatable patterns that sat stubbornly against public confidence. When cranes crossed low and early, when squirrels layered caches thick in dry grass, when jackrabbits turned dense in coat while afternoons still held warmth, the season ahead tended toward severity and abrupt shifts. She said this to almost no one because almost no one asked. Sage Hollow believed in rail timetables, printed almanacs, and the settled certainty of men who sold flour. Silas Pemberton sold flour. He sold nails, lamp oil, bolts of cloth, harness leather, coffee, and patent remedies with labels bright enough to look modern in a place that still smelled of green lumber and mule sweat. He held freight contracts for inbound goods, advanced credit at terms no one called generous aloud, and dressed in dark wool broadcloth that stayed clean despite the dust, with a watch chain that flashed whenever he turned to address a room. He stood 6 feet with a merchant's fullness at the jaw, and hands kept soft by counting stock rather than lifting it. He had a way of smiling before he dismissed a person, as though granting them the honor of being corrected. When Cole asked in late October what he would charge for a used hand auger and 3 lengths of salvage hinge iron, he quoted prices fit for new goods, then told the 2 men weighing feed behind her that she meant to plant widow crops on dead ground. He gave her project a name before she had cut the first sod block. Fisher Folly, he called it, and the phrase passed through town like burr seeds on wool. Cole bought 1 acre west of town limits for $6 cash, though no one else had offered even 2. The parcel sat above the creek bend, where wind struck first and hardest, with a gentle south slope, shallow stone near surface, and alkali patches that silvered after each rain. She paid at the clerk's table on October the 29th, 1884, counted out coins in silence, and carried the folded deed inside her shirt to keep it dry. By the first week of November, she had marked corners with cedar stakes and laid string lines in measured intervals of 8 feet for planned windbreak rows, spacing chosen not for appearance, but for drift management and route competition. The dugout began with labor that looked crude until measured. She cut sod in blocks 18 inches by 12 by 4, using a flat spade sharpened nightly on sandstone. She excavated into the south bank to a depth of 7 feet at rear wall, 14 feet wide and 20 feet long, preserving a 2-degree floor pitch toward a gravel sump lined with fist stone. She set a sill of cottonwood timber scavenged from a collapsed freight crate, then raised interior retaining walls from dry-laid fieldstone chinked with clay and chopped grass. The roof frame used lodgepole saplings set 16 inches on center, overlaid with willow matting, then 6 inches of packed earth, then sod laid green side down, then another 4 inches of earth tamped hard. A man paying for visible architecture would have rejected it on sight. Coal built for thermal mass and wind load, not admiration. On still mornings with frost thick outside, the interior held above freezing by banked heat and careful venting. She added a root cellar 20 paces east, cut deeper at 9 feet and lined in stone and clay, over a footprint of 14 by 22, with 2 intake vents set at opposite corners and wooden baffles to manage airflow. She suspended rodent screens from wire mesh, she bartered off a trapper wagon, and she installed shelves on staggered heights for jar storage, squash rings, and braided carrot ropes. Costs stayed exact in her ledger. $1.60 for mason jars, bought cracked and recapped, 75 cents for hinge iron, $2 for lime to seal vent collars, $4.20 for salvage sash glass. She planned for future cold frames, 18 cents for chalk, 40 cents for extra lamp wicks. Every purchase had a line. Every line had a purpose. Workdays followed a rhythm that made mockery inefficient. She hauled stone at dawn while frost stiffened ground. She cut and stacked sod through mid-morning. At midday, she checked soil moisture in 4 test plots using a hand auger, recording depth to damp layer in inches before choosing where spring seed would go. She ended by lantern, washing jars in ash water and turning seed packets by type and viability year, whispering the same sentence once when voices from town drifted over the draw. Words do not warm a house. The first plantings were modest and deliberate. Drought beans in ridged mounds, turnips in tight grids near wind shadow, carrots where subsoil held moisture 2 inches deeper than the neighboring strip, squash set wide with straw mulch, and seed corn reserved in thirds, so one failed start would not consume the season. She set willow cuttings as windbreak starters on those 8-foot lines and fenced them with brush to keep them from being grazed down. Nothing in the arrangement resembled the straight show rows favored near town. Everything in it answered measured ground and probable weather. When she needed income before harvest, she mended tack for travelers and traded labor at wagon camps for salt, twine, and empty tins. She did not go often to Pemberton's counter after December set in, and when she did, she paid in coin. The town read this as pride and confirmed itself in the reading. Fisher Folly became shorthand for wasted effort, spoken at church steps, at the pump, and beside the depot platform, where men discussed shipments as if discussing weather could command it. Cole kept digging, lining, sealing, spacing, recording. The dugout door swung true by Christmas week, and smoke from her stove rose in a thin, steady line that did not break even when the wind shifted hard from the north. By March 1885, snowmelt ran quick along the trestle ditches north of town, and Cole's ledger pages began a new column in the margin. Rail delay risk against reserve days on hand. She did not announce the column. She sharpened her pencil and kept writing. On March 3, 1885, The morning temperature rose to 38 degrees by 10 o'clock, warm enough to loosen the top crust of snow and send narrow silver threads of runoff down every wagon rut leading to the North Spur, and Cole added a second margin note beside rail delay risk. Trestle watch after thaw surge. She carried the ledger to the doorway, listened to the creek speak louder than it had in weeks, then closed the book and set to work as if the note were already a debt come due. In Sage Hollow, confidence always arrived first and caution second. Men at the depot platform said the rail company had rebuilt worse in less time. Silas Pemberton told two ranch hands that freight delays belonged to spring and never lasted. The wind shifted west. The creek kept rising. By March 19th, runoff had turned the bank below the spur into a soft cut of brown slurry, and two tie sections sat canted where the ballast should have held firm. Cole walked out at dusk with a measuring rod cut from willow, set it against the water line, and found the level 6 inches higher than the previous evening. She did not own authority in town, but she owned habits, and habits gave shape to warning before warning became proof. Her father had taught her one lesson that did not require land title, marriage contract, or merchant credit. Measure first. Speak only after the second measure confirms the first. Gideon Fisher had said it while squinting at cloud bellies over Elk Draw, while checking mule tack for frayed stitching, while dividing grain by weight rather than guess. He had not been a scholar and had not claimed prophecy. He had believed in repeatable signs and paid attention to what returned. On April 2nd, 1885, with noon rain at 34 degrees and sleet striking sideways under a hard northerly gust, 20 yards of trestle on the North Spur gave way beneath a loaded maintenance cart before the morning freight ever reached town. No one died in that break, but the line failed as cleanly as if a knife had cut it. The engine was held at ridge arrest. Flour sacks expected by week's end did not arrive. Salt barrels remained on the far side of washed ground. Kegs of lamp oil stayed in warehouse custody 1 county away. At first, Sage Hollow called it inconvenience. By the second week, men were riding south to ask for wagon alternatives and returning with the same answer from every crossing. Roads were mud to axle depth, bridges compromised, hauls uncertain. 11 weeks of delay began that day, though no one in town could yet count its full length. Silas Pemberton adjusted prices by increments too small to provoke open complaint and large enough to preserve his margin. Flour rose from $4.80 per hundredweight to $6.10. Salt climbed from $1.15 a sack to $1.90. Kerosene increased by the quart. Credit terms narrowed. He explained each change with a merchant's calm and pointed toward the north where the line had failed, as though the broken trestle itself had signed his ledger. Cole purchased little from him in those weeks beyond 1 spool of wire and 2 pounds of nails, both paid in coin, then carried the purchases home strapped to her backboard, while sleet melted into the seams of her coat. She could not prevent shortage in town, but she could widen the distance between her needs and Silas Pemberton's counter. By April 17th, cranes crossed high and early in 2 uneven ribbons, heading north nearly a fortnight ahead of the pattern in Cole's 5-year record. Jackrabbits along the Sage Flats showed heavy undercoat, while afternoon temperatures still reached the low 60s. Squirrels near the creek cottonwoods layered caches thick beneath brush piles, despite broad spring forage. Cole wrote each sign with date, wind direction, cloud cover, and moon phase. She compared the page against prior years and found alignment where she had hoped for contradiction. At dusk, she stood at the edge of her acre and watched dust lift from dry patches already forming where thaw should have held moisture longer. The season ahead would run short. The one after that would harden early. She had enough evidence to warn, and no certainty anyone would hear it. The warning came on a Sunday after service, given not from the pulpit but from the church steps where boots and skirts paused between worship and errands. Cole held her ledger closed against her chest and spoke in a clear, level tone that carried across the hitch rail. She said the trestle break was not the true danger. She said the larger danger was a short harvest cycle, followed by an early killing winter within 3 years, and that reserve days should be increased now, while labor was possible. She gave practical terms: root storage, dried greens, seed partition in thirds, fuel stacked under cover before first frost. She did not ask for fear. She asked for preparation. Silas answered before the crowd thinned. He stood one step above her, coat brushed clean, gloves tucked in belt, and dismissed the warning with a practiced smile that invited agreement before argument began. Weather, he said, belonged to almanacs and rail schedules, not to a girl counting birds in the brush. Several nodded, relieved to be returned to familiar authority. One man laughed and repeated Fisher folly as if it were a proverb. Another asked whether ant mounds would set freight rates next. Cole listened without flinching, waited until the laughter dropped, then turned away and walked home with the ledger under her arm, boots striking mud that would soon dry hard and crack. 3 days passed before she revised her annual plan, and the revision was not dramatic speech but arithmetic. If communal trust could not be counted on, then survival required surplus, and surplus required structure. She shifted target yield from 1 household to 40 mouths through 90 days of snowbound isolation, not because she believed she could feed the entire town, but because she believed rationed reserves might bridge the gap between failure and recovery for whoever reached her door. She added columns for age groups, labor demand, broth grain ratio, and fuel burn per shelter shift. She widened bean acreage by 1/4 strip, reduced squash by 1 row to favor roots that stored longer, and allocated new space for turnip greens to be smoked and packed in cloth rolls. The work expanded through May and June with documentary precision that no mockery could erase. She set 2 cold frames using salvaged sash glass bought the previous autumn, each frame 4 feet by 10, pitched 15 degrees to catch morning sun, joints sealed with lime putty and rag fiber. She deepened the root cellar shelf capacity by adding split pole racks at 3 levels, each level 22 inches apart for airflow. She built suspended rodent guards from repurposed tin collars and wire mesh, hanging them from rafters with rawhide ties soaked and dried hard. She mixed clay with chopped straw in a ratio of 3:1 for jar shelf plaster, reducing crumble and keeping dust from settling into lids. Costs entered the ledger exactly. Hinges, $1.20. Additional jars, $3.05. Hand mill stone resurfacing, 90 cents. Linseed oil for tool handles, 24 cents. By the second week of July, her acre no longer resembled alkali waste but a system. Windbreak lines stood in measured intervals of 8 feet, reinforced with willow stakes and brush wattles at knee height. Moisture plots were mapped not by custom rows but by depth to damp soil, tested after sunset to limit evaporation error. Beans climbed cord twine braided from feed sacks. Carrots were lifted in stages and braided into hanging ropes beneath the eave shade. Turnip greens were blanched, pressed, and smoke-dried over low cottonwood coals for 6 hours at a stretch, then wrapped in waxed cloth and labeled by date. Seed corn was shelled, sorted for fullness, and divided into 3 tins marked A, B, and C, so one bad germination week would not consume the whole future. No part of the system depended on abundance. Every part assumed interruption. Traveling families moving between wagon routes noticed first. A trapper's widow traded 2 sacks of onions for dried beans and asked to copy Cole's vent baffle design. A freighting couple from south of Elkhorn bartered lamp wicks and axle grease for squash rings and seed-saving notes. These exchanges took place at the edge of Cole's yard, with measurements spoken out loud and written down before goods changed hands. Sage Hollow townsfolk often passed without stopping. Some looked with open curiosity, others with the practiced indifference that follows public ridicule one is not ready to retract. Silas maintained his posture in town and continued to predict that first snow would drive Cole to his counter in need. He repeated it often enough that many treated it as settled fact. At lamplight, when jars cooled and tools were cleaned, Cole stacked provisions in the cellar by function rather than crop: broth base, dense starch, greens, seed reserve, trade surplus, and emergency ration. She marked each shelf with chalk and left blank spaces where future harvest would go. The gesture looked optimistic to outsiders. It was discipline. In late August, with the rail line at last restored and store shelves refilled, most of Sage Hollow breathed as if a lesson had ended. Cole treated the restoration as temporary relief and kept expanding capacity. She dug a narrow auxiliary pit near the creek crossing for a cash barrel, depth measured to 4 feet 9 inches below grade to stay below freeze swing, and covered the site with plain brush so no casual passerby would mark it as storage. When September nights cooled early and the first geese formation crossed lower than expected against a quarter moon, she entered the observation without commentary and turned the page. In town, men praised the returning freight and spoke of normal seasons ahead. At Fisher Folly, smoke rose in a narrow, steady line, while Cole sealed another run of jars, tied another bundle of greens, and prepared as if the next 3 winters had already sent notice. The next morning she rose before first light, carried a lantern into the cellar, and began moving jars from crop order to ration order, setting broth bases together, dense starches together, greens together, and seed reserves alone on the highest shelf where no hurried hand would reach by mistake. She marked each section in chalk, then erased and marked again, until the spacing matched her count sheets. If she was building for interruption, she could not store like a gardener planning only for supper. By the first week of October 1885, she had started a second exterior trench on the lee side of the dugout, 3 feet deep and lined with gravel and split stone, not as a drain alone, but as a frost break to keep ground heave from shifting her doorway frame. She cut 12 new sod blocks each day after noon meal, stacked them under canvas, and rotated them so the heavier blocks dried evenly before use. The ledger recorded labor and cost in the same dry hand. 2 replacement shovel handles, 30 cents, 1 keg of cut nails, $1.10, pitch for seam sealing, 42 cents. She raised a lean-to smoke shed against the barn wall with a vent aperture measured at 6 inches by 10, then tested draft strength with strips of damp cloth until smoke rose cleanly rather than settling back into the chamber. Turnip greens hung there in tight bundles above low coals, and by nightfall, each bundle had lost weight without losing color. Through the winter of 1885 into 1886, while Sage Hollow counted on reopened freight and ordinary weather, Cole tested routines that would matter only under stress. She timed the walk from dugout door to well in daylight and in darkness. She paced the route during high wind and marked where drift shoulders formed against the windbreak rows. She drove posts and strung a fixed rope line from door lintel to pump frame, then from pump frame to barn corner, keeping knots at arm-length intervals so a hand numbed by cold could read distance by touch alone. Inside, she standardized fuel feed for the stove at measured intervals, balancing heat against wood supply, and found that her earth-bermed walls held interior temperature near 48 degrees, even when outside readings dropped below 0 for 2 consecutive nights. The difference was not comfort. The difference was survivable margin. When thaw came in March 1886, she widened cultivation by process rather than acreage. Moisture tests were taken every third evening from the same points. Auger depth logged to the nearest half inch. Where damp held below 7 inches, she placed carrots and beets. Where damp failed early, she placed beans on mounded ridges with windward draw. She built 2 additional cold frames from warped sash she replaned by hand, each 4 by 10 feet, each angled 15 degrees, each set on stone skirts to reduce soil chill. She lined frame joints with rag and lime putty, then weighted lids with flat rock so spring gusts could not tear glass from hinge. Seed corn remained partitioned in thirds, with planting staggered 9 days apart to protect against one bad frost window. She did not trust a single date. She trusted sequence. By June 1886, Fisher Folly had become a working compound rather than a single dugout. Cellar, smoke shed, cold frames, windbreak rows, tool rack under cover, drying lines, seed table, ash pit, and 2 hidden storage points mapped by bearing and step count in the ledger margin. She added a hand mill mounted on a cedar base and reinforced the mount with iron straps, so grinding did not shake bolts loose. She purchased 48 more jars from a freighter clearing damaged stock and recapped everyone with tallow-treated seals. Expenditures over 2 seasons reached $27.90. Yield rose beyond one household's use. She answered the rise by tightening method again, entering shelf life estimates by month and crop, assigning rotation order, and setting minimum holdback for spring seed before any trade could occur. Mockery did not decline as her system improved. It sharpened because improvement was visible. Silas Pemberton began using Fisher Folly as a caution line whenever young laborers asked credit for tools, saying that hard work without proper sense only dug a person deeper into dirt. He set it at his counter with ledgers open and witnesses near enough to carry the phrase to every porch in town. He offered coal barrel staves at rates higher than those charged to ranchmen with overdue notes, then told bystanders she refused fair dealing out of pride. When she brought dried beans to market one Saturday in late July, he weighed the lot, named a purchase price below travel trade value, and added that she should accept, while anyone was still willing to buy, cellar food from alkali ground. She lifted the sack from his scale, thanked him for his time, and carried it back out without argument. By dusk, she had traded the same beans to a wagon family for salt, twine, and 2 sound hinges. The exclusion spread in smaller ways that left no single scene to point at and no law to challenge. Women planning autumn exchange circles did not send word to her door. Men choosing crews for shared ditch clearing passed her acre and hired one another first. A church committee listed households for winter coal allotment discussions and omitted her name on the claim that she lived outside the core blocks. At the well, conversation often paused when she approached and resumed when she had filled her pails and gone. Such actions were ordinary enough to be denied and consistent enough to be felt. In September 1886, Silas escalated from ridicule to prediction. On the depot platform, where freight talk served as public doctrine, he declared before a knot of teamsters that Coal Fisher would be standing at his counter by first snow, cup in hand, because no hole in the ground could outlast a Wyoming winter. The line returned to her by evening through 3 different mouths, each repeating it as if repetition gave it proof. She answered no messenger. She checked her stove seals, split more cottonwood, and entered one sentence below the fuel table. Words do not warm a house. By early spring 1887, her records had become a discipline few in town understood, and none could dismiss on technical grounds if they had taken time to inspect them. She mapped germination rates by bed orientation, noting that east-facing strips outperformed north-facing by 11% under that year's wind pattern. She converted one corner of the cellar to hanging storage for onion braids and garlic, increasing airflow clearance to 3 inches between bundles. She experimented with clay lid seals mixed at different ash ratios and settled on a blend that cut spoilage and carrots by nearly 1/4. She installed suspended mesh cradles for squash rings to keep mice from lower shelves. Total spending across 3 seasons reached $41.30, nearly all in jars, hinges, mesh, and mill repairs, and every cent carried measurable return in retained food or retained seed. The town saw the output and named it excess. Children sent on errands past her fence and counted stacked crates. Men laughed that she was provisioning for a regiment. Silas told a customer that she hoarded because she had no family table to fill, and several repeated the line until it hardened into common speech. Cole neither contested nor explained. She expanded anyway. In August, she stood in the cellar aisle with lantern held high and recognized a practical problem she had worked to earn. One woman could not consume 1/3 of what those shelves now held before spoilage windows opened. She did not celebrate. She revised objective. By August 12, 1887, she had divided the cellar into ration bays marked in chalk for children, elders, and labor crews, assigning caloric density and cooking time to each section so fuel demands could be matched during scarcity. She buried 2 cash barrels near the creek crossing at measured depth below freeze swing, packed one with dried mash and smoked greens, the other with beans and grain, and disguised both sites under brush and scatterstone. She reset rope lines between dugout, well, and barn with doubled knots for whiteout navigation. She cut thaw bricks from compacted snow, tested melt rates near the stove, and calculated water output per brick so she could estimate minimum daily survival volume if the pump froze. Preparation had moved beyond private endurance. It had become triage design. The first crack in town pride came through youth rather than authority. Ruth Calder, 13 years old and daughter of the blacksmith, appeared at Cole's gate one late afternoon with a broken bucket handle and a question about seed saving she claimed was for school copywork. Cole repaired the handle, then showed her how to dry bean seed separate from eating stock, how to mark envelopes by month, and how to keep the strongest kernels for uncertain spring. Ruth returned the next week, then again, each visit carrying a small practical question and leaving with written notes in careful hand. By October, she'd begun carrying brief warning slips from Cole to households willing to read quietly, mostly those with infants, old parents, or no wagon team. Not every door accepted the paper. Enough did. By the second week of October 1887, signs multiplied beyond any single season's variance. Crane flights crossed 2 weeks early and lower than recorded in the previous 5-year set. Jackrabbits near Sage Flats were already in heavy coat despite mild afternoons. Squirrels built caches with unusual depth and dense layering under dry grass. Beaver repairs along the creek rose higher than spring flood marks warranted. Cole checked each observation twice, compared against her prior columns, and found the same alignment she had warned of on church steps 2 years earlier, now stronger and more unified. She took the warning again to town, not as accusation but as instruction. On 3 evenings, she stood near the pump and read practical steps from her ledger. Increase root storage now. Partition seed in thirds. Shelter fuel under cover. Lash roof boards before freeze. Set rope guides between house and water source. Hold emergency broth stock for children and elders. Some listened with guarded attention. Some thanked her and did little. Silas answered with public confidence as he had before, saying warm November meant sound winter and that expensive extra freight would only rot in sheds if ordered on fear. He controlled the contracts, and in late November he cut winter stock orders to preserve cash, reducing flour, salt, and coal allotments below prior year volume, just as the settlement congratulated itself on fair weather. The calm that followed was broad, bright, and deceptive. Daytime highs lingered near 40. Mud held in wagon ruts and churchyard conversations turned toward ordinary Christmas plans. Cole treated the warmth as hazard. She moved additional rations into ready bins, stacked split fuel by door sequence, checked rope lines, and instructed Ruth on thaw brick placement and basic broth mixing for weak stomachs. On November 30th, 1887, she made her final entry before the storm month began. Pressure falling fast, wind uncertain at dawn, geese absent, dogs restless through the night. Then she closed the ledger, wrapped it in oiled cloth, and placed it on the highest shelf above the seed tins marked A, B, and C. In the dark before dawn on December 1st, 1887, the pressure dropped so quickly that lamp flames in Sage Hollow drew long and thin, then fluttered blue at their base, and by sunrise the north horizon had flattened into a hard gray shelf that erased the distant ridges. Cole stepped out once to test the wind with ash from her stovepan, watched it drive straight south without swirl, and went back inside to seal the final seam at her door lintel with warm pitch and cloth. The town did not yet read danger in that morning. Wagons moved at ordinary pace. Two men argued over harness leather outside Pemberton's store. A freight rumor passed from the depot to the pump and changed shape 3 times before noon. The calm held through December 2nd, mild enough that slush formed in ruts by midday and froze smooth again after dusk, and Silas Pemberton took that softness as public proof. He stood under his store awning in his dark wool coat and told 3 ranch hands he had spared Sage Hollow from waste by cutting heavy winter orders. He said no merchant should buy fear by the barrel. On December 3rd, at a little before 5 in the morning, the wind struck with a force that made nailed signs ring against their posts like struck metal. The outside thermometer nailed at the church porch read 28 degrees at first light. By noon, it read -6. By 7 that evening, it read -34. 14 hours had taken 62 degrees from the valley. The storm did not come as drifting flakes. It came as driven powder so fine and fast that it entered keyholes, hinge seams, and the weave of wool, then packed into ridges hard as salt where wind met wall. By nightfall, the lane between church and bunkhouse had vanished under a single rolling surface of white, and doorsteps were no longer steps but smooth shoulders that rose toward window height. Men who had planned to brace roofs after supper found ladders already useless in crosswind. Women who had left washtubs by porches found them buried by noon and unreachable by dusk. Horses turned their hindquarters into the gale and stood with eyes nearly shut, ice thickening on mane and flank. Cole moved by sequence she had drilled through 2 winters. She set stove feed at measured intervals, checked vent draw, knocked ice from the pump handle before it could lock, and verified rope lines by gloved hand, from dugout to well, from well to barn, from barn back to door. She shifted broth jars to the lower shelf nearest the stove corner, moved dense mash sacks to the ration table, and placed thaw bricks within easy reach of the iron pot. When Ruth Calder arrived at mid-morning on December 4th, wrapped in a blanket over her coat and half blinded by blown snow, Cole tied an extra scarf over the girl's mouth, put a knot map in her mitten, and sent her back along the rope with a warning for her father: lash roof boards now and keep the forge fire banked, not high. By dawn on December 4th, drifts stood to sill height on the windward side of most townhouses, and the storm had entered its 2nd day without easing. Silas Pemberton's store had been built broad and proud to show goods through front glass, with a tall false front and shallow roof pitch that looked prosperous in still weather and answered badly to sustain load. The first roof section failed just after noon on day 2. Not in a dramatic crash, but in a long tearing sag over the rear storeroom, where flour should have been stacked deep for winter. Men working the alley heard rafters complain, then saw shingles peel away in strips and vanish into white air. Silas ordered tarps, then rope, then hands to climb. No one could hold footing on that pitch in the crosswind. By evening, snow had entered through the open seam and buried 2/3 of his backstock where it stood. At first, he tried to preserve the appearance of command. He kept the front door open in shifts, sold what could be reached, and barked figures over the counter while clerks stamped feet for warmth. On day 3, wind tore the stovepipe cap away and snapped the upper section where it cleared the roofline. Smoke rolled back into the store in bitter waves. Shelves fogged with soot. Clerks coughed and went outside, then came back in only because outside offered no shelter either. Silas wrapped a scarf around his face and kept counting by lantern light as if arithmetic could hold weather at bay. By day 4, the famous shelves were almost bare. Flour sacks were gone. Salt bins were scraped to wood. Beans sold loose by cup had vanished before sunrise. What remained in quantity was lamp oil and 2 cracked crocks of molasses hardened by cold near the rear wall. Souls who had trusted rail and merchant schedule stood in line for whatever could still be weighed, then left with less than 1 day's food in hand. In that line, no one spoke the phrase Fisher folly. The storm continued into December 5th and December 6th with no true break, only brief lulls that invited movement and then closed like doors. Wind reached speeds old teamsters later estimated at 50 miles an hour in the exposed stretch by the depot cut, enough to drive snow sideways under doors and lift loose planks from unbraced sheds. Roof boards cartwheeled down alleys and disappeared. Chickens froze on perches where coops had split. 2 outbuildings collapsed under drift load before dawn on December 6th. At the church, men took turns shoveling the lee entry every 2 hours and still lost the threshold each time. The storm became not weather but siege. It stripped the town of pretense first, then of options. On the afternoon of December 6th, Maeve Dunn tied a rope from her back porch to the calf shed 30 yards away and stepped into a white curtain with a feed bucket in one hand and an axe in the other to clear the latch. She was 32 years old, a mother of 2 boys, and known for never missing morning hymn even in mud season. The rope iced over within minutes. A gust threw a drift shoulder across the line, and when she tried to turn back, she struck the buried fence instead of the porch posts. Her husband found her at dusk after following the rope on hands and knees, the bucket overturned, the calf still calling behind a jammed door she had almost reached. They carried her in wrapped in quilts. She did not survive the night. Word of Maeve's death moved through Sage Hollow by shouted relays between doorways because no one could trust open travel farther than a few rods. The warning was immediate and severe. Do not leave alone. Tie high lines, not low. Mark every turn. Keep children indoors, no matter what animals cried outside. Yet necessity kept pushing souls into exposure. On December the 7th, Thomas Reed tried to clear the packed drift against his cabin entrance after the north wall took strain from accumulated snow. He was a carpenter by trade, 41 years old, with 1 daughter and a wife still weak from autumn fever. The wall slumped as he worked, dropping a hard slab of packed snow and framing timber across the threshold. He was pinned long enough in cold air that a lung sickness settled before neighbors could dig through to him. Cole sent mustard poultice and hot mash through Ruth that evening, then sent thaw bricks at dawn. Thomas Reed died on December 9th with his daughter's hand in his and his carpentry square on the blanket beside him, the one tool he had carried from Nebraska when he first came west. 3 days later, on December 12th, old Elijah Pike left the church after helping inventory remaining coal and said he could make the walk to bunkhouse in 10 minutes by the usual path. He had made that walk for 9 winters and knew every post by touch in fair conditions. In the whiteout, he lost the trail where drift erased the turn by the livery fence. Searchers found him before midnight near the wagon tongue pile, seated upright against a post as if resting, hat brim packed with rime and one glove missing. He had served as bell ringer since Sage Hollow set its first frame church. At his burial, the bell rope was tied in black cloth. By December 10th, midway through the storm cycle, hunger and cold worked together in every household that had planned for one and not both. Children cried from thin broth. Elderly souls took to bed not from one wound but from steady heat loss. Kerosene burned low in lamps that had once been lit through whole evenings. Coal was rationed by shovel count. Firewood stacks dropped faster than any prior winter because stoves were run hard against windseep and uninsulated boards. At Pemberton's store, shelves that had represented certainty now displayed absence in ordered rows. A few tins, some lamp chimneys, the molasses crocks, and nothing else that could sustain a family through another week of confinement. Silas wore 2 coats by then. Gloves split at fingertips, beard rimed with frost where his scarf shifted as he breathed. Wealth had not vanished, but privilege had lost utility. Inside Fisher Folly, the contrast was plain and practical. Earth-bermed walls held near 47 degrees, even when outside air hovered below -20 at dusk. The cellar remained accessible because Cole had cut and recut the lee trench every shift. Rations were not abundant in the manner of feast, but they were structured. Broth base for hydration and warmth, dense mash for labor, dried greens for mineral strength, beans portioned by age and work demand. The rope line to the well remained passable because she had doubled knots and kept the path cleared to shoulder width whenever wind eased by a fraction. The first request for help came in full humility, carried by the one household that had listened early and now had no reserve left. Late on December 10th, Ruth Calder appeared at Cole's door again, this time with her father, Jonas Calder, the blacksmith who had once stood silent while others laughed at Fisher Folly on the depot platform. His beard held ice to the collar, and his right hand shook from cold even through mittens. Behind them, dim in the blown dark, stood 2 more figures from town with a hand sled and an empty grain sack tied flat to its runners. Jonas did not step inside until Cole nodded. He removed his hat and spoke in a voice stripped down by fatigue. The East Row has no flour left. The Pike bunkhouse has 6 elders and 2 children on broth, made from boiled leather scrap. We can still pull a sled if we tie to your line. Tell us what to carry and where to set it. Cole did not ask who had mocked, who had believed, or who had voted with Silas when freight was cut. She handed Ruth a lantern shielded with tin, gave Jonas a chalkboard with portion marks, and brought out sacks in exact order. Mash first, beans second, greens third, then 2 jars of rendered fat wrapped in cloth. She assigned routes by survivable distance, not sentiment. Calder House, Pike Bunkhouse, Church Annex. She set return intervals at 40 minutes and ordered every runner to clip to rope at waist height with rawhide loops. Take this line to the well post, she said. From there, split by pairs. No one walks alone. If the wind rises, drop flat. Keep one hand on rope and wait. Come back for more before you're asked. Jonas swallowed once and nodded. Ruth took the first load without being told to stand back. By the morning of the 11th of December, a queue had formed at Fisher Folly. Not a crowd pressing in panic, but small teams arriving by rope guide, each carrying containers, blankets, or tools, each waiting for measured allotment and instruction. Among them, near midday, stood Silas Pemberton with a split shovel handle over one shoulder and his merchant gloves torn open at both palms. He did not speak first. Cole set a water yoke at his feet and pointed toward the well line. You can haul 8 buckets each run, she said. Stack split fuel under the church awning after. Return before dusk bell. He lifted the yoke and went where she directed, boots sinking to knee depth at the first drift shoulder, his broadcloth coat whitened to the hem within minutes. In that weather, rank had no shelter. Work did. By December 13th, 3 days after help was first sought at her door, Cole had converted her private reserve into a town triage system in motion, and Sage Hollow had begun, one rope length at a time, to relearn how survival is shared. By nightfall on December the 13th, Cole had turned the yard at Fisher Folly into a working depot marked by lantern tin, chalkboards, and rope knots, and each soul who arrived left not merely with food, but with procedure. She wrote ration marks in 3 columns, children, elders, labor crews, and made every runner repeat them aloud before stepping back into White Wind. She demonstrated how to bank coals in shallow beds so fuel lasted through 12 hours, how to vent stovepipes in gusts so smoke did not choke sleeping rooms, and how to thaw frozen pump handles with wrapped bricks instead of open flame that cracked iron. Her stores fed bodies. Her instruction preserved stores. On December 14th, with the noon reading still below -20 and wind driving from the same north line, she opened the first creek cash barrel in front of Jonas Calder and 2 rail hands so no rumor could poison distribution. The brush cover came off, the packed earth was cut back with short spades, and the lid rose to reveal dry mash sacks sealed in waxed cloth exactly as her ledger had listed. She handed Jonas the page itself. Date, depth, contents, expected yield, and told him to carry both barrel and record to the church annex, where Abigail Dunn and Reverend Hale had begun a central kitchen. Expensive failures had already stripped Sage Hollow's grandest shelves bare. $6 of despised alkali land now held the town's surest reserve. Silas Pemberton learned quickly when instruction was given as labor rather than argument. He hauled water on the rope line until his shoulders trembled, split cottonwood under the church awning until his palms bled through torn glove seams, and stood in queue like every other hand for measured allotment. When one man urged him to take an extra jar because he had once extended credit in town, Cole cut the suggestion short with the same calm she used for everyone. Credit is a summer instrument, she said. Portion is a winter instrument. Take your mark and return in 40 minutes. Silas lowered his eyes, took his mark, and returned in 40 minutes. By December 15th, the shelter rotation reached full design. 187 souls passed through Fisher Folly in shifts, never all at once, warming in 40-minute intervals against earth-banked walls that held near 47 degrees, while outside air remained lethal. Mothers sat with children near the stove corner. Elders were placed by the south wall where drafts were weakest, and labor crews ate standing from tin cups before returning to dig lanes between doorways. Ruth Calder carried thaw bricks and poultices until her boots split at the seams, then accepted a repaired pair from Cole without ceremony, and walked out again into a gale that erased tracks within seconds. Youth had cracked the town's pride first. Youth now helped hold the line. 3 days later, on the morning of December 18th, the wind fell from a scream to a hard, steady rush, then to something that resembled weather again. The whiteout did not end in sunlight. It ended in gray silence and the sound of shovels. Doorways were cut open. Livestock pens were located by probing poles. The church bell rang once at noon for the living and once at dusk for the dead. Maeve Dunn, Thomas Reed, and Elijah Pike were buried on December the 20th, each coffin carried by teams that had eaten from Cole's shelves, each grave marked before the ground hardened beyond iron. No one called the losses accidental. They called them the price of delay, pride, and unprepared structures. In the week that followed, reckoning began not at the pulpit but at Cole's threshold, one pair of boots at a time. Abigail Dunn came first, face hollowed by grief, and said she had repeated Fisher folly at the pump because she feared becoming the next household excluded from trade. She asked for nothing except instruction on cellar ventilation and left carrying a hand sketch with vent heights marked in inches. Jonas Calder came after sunset and admitted he had stood silent when Silas mocked her on the church steps in 1885. Cole gave him no absolution and no rebuke. She set him to measuring frost depth along his east wall and told him to return with numbers, not regret. He returned the next day with numbers. By the first Sunday of January 1888, the private visits had become too many for private handling, and Reverend Hale asked whether the town should gather and speak plainly before spring work began. Cole agreed on one condition. No speech would be made that did not include a practical change attached to it. The church filled beyond benches, coats still patched from storm damage, hands scarred from shovels and axe hafts. The air smelled of wool, coal soot, and damp leather drying by stove heat. Ruth sat beside her father in the front row, ledger copy in her lap. Silas stood when called and remained standing for a long moment before words came. He repeated his own lines without trimming them. He had called her work widow crops on dead ground. He had called her home Fisher folly. He had cut winter freight to save fees and had trusted his books over warning signs he had not bothered to learn. Then he named what followed in plain sequence. Empty flour bins by day 4, smoke backflow through a broken pipe, children at his counter with cups and no grain to sell them, and his own survival purchased by the woman he had publicly diminished. He did not ask for quick pardon. He asked what duty remained for him if trust could be rebuilt at all. Others followed. Martha Keel admitted she had refused to include coal in coal allotment planning and had done so to protect standing with merchant families. 2 railmen confessed they had laughed at rope lines as if they were theatrics, then used those same knots to carry broth to the bunkhouse during the worst gusts. A ranch foreman recalled saying no hole in the ground could outlast Wyoming winter, then described warming his frost-numbed hands against Cole's earth wall while his own board house cracked in the wind. Each confession was tied to a commitment. Vent retrofits, shared seed holds, mandatory reserve floors before sale, roof bracing standards, a winter kitchen roster. Shame was spoken but not performed for relief. It was harnessed to work. When Reverend Hale turned to Cole, the room settled into the kind of silence that had once waited for freight numbers. She stood with her ledger in both hands, pages swollen from years of use, and spoke in an even tone that carried to the back wall without strain. Her answer did not flatter the room. It also did not wound it. My father taught me to measure twice before speaking once. This town did not measure. It assumed. 3 souls are dead, and no sentence spoken here can return them. I did not build for vindication, and I will not keep account of humiliation as if it were currency. Forgiveness is smaller than the task in front of us. If you seek something from me, seek instruction. Bring your soil samples, your roof spans, your vent plans, your seed stock, your fuel counts. I will teach any hand that will learn. Store for neighbors before self. Mark your reserves before hunger. Read sky, ground, and animals together, not one at a time. If Sage Hollow chooses that discipline, then the dead will have left us a law worth keeping. No one applauded. They stood instead, row by row, and formed a line at the front table where Ruth recorded names beside tasks for spring. Silas signed his name third and pledged freight margin to a communal reserve fund audited by 2 households outside his own trade circle. Cole signed last, then reopened her ledger to a blank page and wrote the date. By April 1888, Thaw had exposed every structural weakness the storm had carved, and Sage Hollow answered with labor organized by the standards born in Fisher Folly. 40 homes began or expanded root cellars with stone lining and clay seals. Intake and exhaust vents were cut at opposing corners with baffles built to Cole's drawings. Roof pitches were altered where possible, and where timber could not be replaced, drift braces were added at measured intervals. Rope guides appeared between doors and wells across the settlement, at first awkward and uneven, then straighter as crews learned knot spacing by gloved reach. Seed circles were established each spring, 3 tins per household marked A, B, and C in deliberate imitation of Cole's reserve method. By the second week of October 1889, the phrase "build it" like Fisher had entered ordinary speech in Sage Hollow, not as praise shouted from porches but as practical instruction exchanged over workbenches. Children used it while stacking kindling under cover. Teamsters used it when lashing loads against crosswind. Abigail Dunn used it while teaching Maeve's boys to mark jar dates before placing them on cellar shelves Maeve had never lived to see. Silas Pemberton kept his store, but not his former doctrine. He posted freight ledgers openly each month, maintained fixed winter minimum stock by public vote, and ceded reserve keys to a 3-household committee that included Jonas Calder and later Ruth herself when she reached 16 and could outcount most grown men with a pencil stub and a straight face. Years moved. Sage Hollow grew to 349 souls by 1894, then steadied as rail patterns shifted and nearby camps rose and fell. Cole never sought office and never left her acre. She expanded instruction instead, holding autumn workshops at the church annex where she taught moisture testing, cache depth, smoke-drying temperatures, and the mathematics of rationing by labor output rather than appetite. She charged no fee for teaching. She accepted payment only in materials for communal stores, jars, hinges, mesh, lime, and once a full wagon of split willow for new windbreak rows south of town. Ruth Calder became her strongest assistant, then the town's first formal record keeper for weather signs, maintaining parallel ledgers that tracked flight heights, frost dates, and rail delay days with the same spare discipline Cole had carried since girlhood. Decades later, the dugout still stands above Sage Hollow's creek bend, earth-banked and plain, its doorway lower than fashion and stronger than fashion ever was. The cellar remains cool in July heat and stable in January cold. School children walk there each autumn with slates in hand and copy the carved lintel words before they learn fractions. Preparation is a form of mercy. They run their fingers through the cuts, then turn to the fields where windbreak rows hold snow in measured lines and 40 old cellar doors, repaired and replaced across generations, still open each fall to receive food set aside first for winter, then for neighbor, then for self. One October morning, when frost still sat silver on the willow stakes and the creek gave off a low ribbon of mist, Ruth Calder set a slate on the dugout sill and asked the children to read the carved line aloud once more, slowly, until each word sounded like instruction instead of decoration. Cole stood beside her with a wool shawl over her shoulders, hair gone iron gray, hands still broad and scarred across the knuckles from shovel haft and jar wire. She waited for the smallest boy to finish tracing the final letter, then lifted the old canvas seed sack she had carried out of town in 1884 and held it open so they could see the paper packets, folded, restitched, and labeled in a hand that had not changed much in 20 years. "These are not relics," she said. "They are records of choice. A seed kept dry is next spring. A seed eaten in fear is one meal. You must learn when each act is right." She set 3 small tins on the sill, each dented and burnished by use, the letters A, B, and C scratched deep enough to outlast paint. Ruth called names from her roll, and each child came forward to weigh kernels on a brass balance, then wrote the count to the nearest quarter ounce. Two mothers watched from the path, both of them survivors of the blizzard year, both carrying empty jars for the communal exchange. Across the yard, Jonas Calder and Maeve Dunn's eldest son levered up the marker stone over the Second Creek cache, the one that had remained sealed after the storm, and checked the waxed cloth bundles inside against Cole's old depth note. 4 feet 9 inches below grade, still dry, still usable, now due for rotation into the church reserve before first hard freeze. At noon, the church bell rang twice for inventory day, and Sage Hollow moved as one body toward practical work that had once required persuasion. The committee table stood under the annex awning with scales, ledgers, and chalk in plain sight. Silas Pemberton, older and thinner than any soul remembered from his broadcloth years, laid the store reserve key on the table before anyone asked, and read the month figures from a page signed by 3 households outside his own kin. Flour minimum met. Salt minimum met. Dried bean reserve above minimum by 8 sacks. Lamp oil at winter floor. Coal at 86% of target, with 2 wagon loads due before November 20th if the road held. He paused once, looked toward Cole without theatricality, and added that freight margins remained fixed by vote and could not be altered by merchant discretion until spring thaw. No one cheered. They checked the numbers. Abigail Dunn counted sack ties and matched them to entries. Ruth inspected jar seals for bloom. Jonas tested the rope lines between annex, well, and bunkhouse by walking them blindfolded with gloves on, knot by knot, as he had done every autumn since 1888. A ranch foreman named Peter Hale, who had once spoken against dugouts in front of the depot and never stood to confess in church, waited until the tally was complete, then stepped to Cole with his hat in both hands and delivered the apology he had delayed for 9 years. "I watched you carry sacks through wind while I kept my mouth shut to keep favor with men who sold to me," he said. "I told myself silence was prudence. It was cowardice. My youngest girl lived because your broth reached our door on the 6th night. I cannot correct the year behind us, but I can put my teams where you direct before this winter sets." Cole regarded him for a long moment, then pointed to the chalkboard where drift brace assignments were listed by mile section. "Take section 3 by the north ditch and train 2 boys to set braces true on first measure," she said. "If you want to amend a silence, teach loudly." By the second week of November 1896, the warning signs began to align in a pattern older hands now recognized without argument. Geese crossed low in broken ribbons. Ant mound collars stood high and compact. Dogs in 3 blocks whined through the night and refused open yard at dawn. At evening check, lamp flames in the annex drew narrow and blue at the base, the same detail Cole had marked before the storm year. She did not raise alarm by sermon. She rang one short bell, the signal agreed on at spring council, and teams moved to pre-assigned tasks. Children carried kindling under cover. Labor crews cleared lee trenches. Mothers shifted elder bedding to interior walls. Reserve tins moved from household shelves to the annex lockroom and were marked by household name and return weight. Snow arrived hard on November 18th, with wind from the north and temperatures dropping from 26 at sunrise to -9 by midnight. A severe strike, though not the prolonged siege of 1887. The difference lay not in mercy from weather, but in competence from labor. Roof braces held. Rope lines held. Vent baffles held. Every home had broth base ready by dark. The church kitchen ran on schedule cards copied from Cole's old ration sheets. Silas hauled water with 2 apprentices and logged each run. Peter Hale's teams brought split willow to the east row before the drifts deepened. When a bunkhouse stove smoked back on the second night, A 15-year-old girl corrected the draft using the same cloth strip test Cole had taught in the smoke shed years before. No child went to bed on boiled leather. No elder was left without heat. No graves were opened when the wind settled. After the storm, with snow still banked to window height in places, the town gathered again in the annex, not for confession this time, but for audit. Every cache was opened, weighed, and either replenished or retired. The first creek barrel, damaged at one seam, was dismantled and its iron hoops repurposed into pump handle collars. The second barrel, still sound, was resealed with fresh waxed cloth and reburied at the same depth with 2 witness signatures in Ruth's weather book. Cole's original stitched ledger, pages swollen and corners gone soft from years of glove and lamp soot, was copied line for line by 3 students and placed in a cedar box at the church, available to any household willing to sign it out and return it dry. Nothing remained mysterious. Every tool and record had a place, a use, and a steward. On March 4th, 1902, with thaw beginning in the south, ditches and the population roll reading 361 souls, Sage Hollow held its spring planning council in clear weather. Cole did not preside. She sat in the second row with her shawl folded, listening while Ruth, now town recorder, read the agenda in the same plain cadence Cole had used when she first read warnings on church steps. Seed circles assigned by soil band, freight floors confirmed by public vote. Winter reserve percentages set by household size and labor capacity. Youth training days fixed for August, with instruction at Fisher Folly on moisture testing, cache depth, and ration mathematics. When the vote closed, Silas asked to speak briefly. His hands shook with age, but his voice carried. "I once treated knowledge as rank," he said. "I mistook inventory for wisdom and confidence for duty. This town survives now because one young woman measured what the rest of us mocked. If there is honor left to me, it is in saying that aloud until my voice fails." Cole answered from her seat without rising. "Then keep saying it in ledgers, not speeches," she said, and several in the room nodded, because that had become the town's language. When she died in January 1908, at 43 years of age, after an illness that kept her by the dugout stove through the first deep cold, the procession from church to creek bend stretched past the old pump and down the lane where rope knots still hung each winter. Ruth placed the 3 seed tins on the table during the service, then returned them to the cellar shelf by evening, because instruction required continuity more than ceremony. Jonas, white-haired and slow but steady, set Cole's shovel against the lintel and left it there through spring planting as the children passed in and out with slates. Silas stood at the back and wept without display. The dugout still stands above Sage Hollow's creek bend. In October, children still read the carved words with cold breath clouding before them. In November, households still weigh seed into A, B, and C tins and mark return weights in ledgers copied from Cole's hand. In winter, rope lines still run from doors to wells, and no one laughs at knots. Preparation remains a form of mercy, and in Sage Hollow, mercy is practiced with chalk, jars, measured depth, and food set aside first for winter, then for neighbor, then for self.